Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the subject of RIOS 2016. We will cover an overview of the changes to the standard this morning once we go ahead and get started, which we will do in just a couple seconds. We'll give everyone a little bit more time to hop on here. Okay. So, like I said, today's webinar is on the subject of RIOS 2016. Welcome from PJR. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. And I have a brief agenda on the screen. Today we will cover, we'll talk a little bit about PJR, who we are and what we do. We will also cover the benefits and drivers behind a certification such as RIOS. We will talk about transition timelines and what that process looks like. We will cover the key changes of the standard, including some changed terminology. Then we will focus in a little more detail, looking at a clause-by-clause overview of the changes. We will close the webinar by going over the certification process for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time and isn't too familiar with what that process looks like. And at the very end, we will leave some time for questions. So at any point during the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat field, and I will save those for the end of the presentation. So Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have a list here. It's not all inclusive, but it certainly gives you an idea of our global presence, a variety of countries where we have certified companies to a variety of standards. And PJR is accredited to grant certification for, as I said, a variety of standards, including RIOS 2016, which is what we are focusing on today. Benefits of certification vary by standard and industry, to be sure, but in general, a standard such as RIOS, which covers quality, environmental, health, and safety subjects, some of the benefits include improving the organization's quality, environmental, health, and safety performance, which you'll see abbreviated as QEH&S or QEHS throughout the presentation. Another benefit would be the minimization of risks. There are benefits to material sourcing and outsourcing controls, management commitment and employee engagement. Holding a certification such as RIOS can provide a competitive advantage over other companies or competitors who do not hold a certification themselves, and or an improved public image, being able to advertise that you're certified to a standard that promotes quality or promotes environmental awareness or health and safety controls, that you're making those a priority and you're being held to that standard, you're maintaining that system, being audited those requirements to maintain that certificate, and that you're being proactive in that way can improve public image as well. There can be other financial benefits in some industries, and with some standards, there may be insurance reductions that can be provided since you are, again, being audited, being proactive, being held to those requirements throughout the year. The standards provide a framework for meeting customer and or regulatory requirements that your company may be subject to. And the standard represents a commitment to the responsible management of recyclables. So again, that might provide a competitive advantage or improve your public image, being able to advertise your certification to the standard and what that really represents. So for anyone who was certified to the previous version of the RIOS standard, which would have been RIOS 2006, the transition deadline has already passed. The transition deadline was September 30th of 2019. And I only left this slide in here to confirm in case anyone somehow missed that boat. If you have not transitioned, you'll need to start over to pursue certification for the first time for RIOS 2016 because your certificate would have lapsed. There are many reasons why standards are revised. These are the general reasons why a standard might be revised in an attempt to maintain market relevance, continue to be compatible with other management system standards that also might have been revised, to maintain or ensure that the standards are easy to use, that there is sufficient topic coverage as necessary to be able to appropriately apply the standard across a variety of sectors, sufficient flexibility of the verbiage of the standard to be able to, again, apply to a variety of organizations or sectors. It should be able to be applied to organizations of various size as well. A standard might also be revised to ensure it is easily understood or make it easier to understand, which would include making sure it's easy to translate, free from ambiguous language, things that might trip up users or make it inconsistently applied. Beyond those general reasons for revising a standard, at a high level, the key changes in RIOS 2016 compared to the previous version, RIOS 2006, include a greater emphasis on leadership, focus on proactivity and risk management, emphasis on the outcomes of the management system, changes to communication and awareness, including both stakeholder and customer requirements, and expectations around change management. And we will talk about these changes in more detail, but at a high level, these are the key changes in RIOS 2016 compared to the previous version of the standard. I'm not going to go through the key term changes, but I did include them in the slides for anyone who wants to review them on their own time. And now would be a good time to remind everyone that the slides from today's webinar, as well as a recording of today's webinar, will be available through PGR's website after the presentation. So it may be worthwhile to review some of these key terms to make sure that you're understanding the verbiage of the standard and how it's expected to be applied. And these terms are found within the standard itself as well. So you can also reference the standard itself to familiarize yourself with the definitions if you have not already done so. These would be the most significantly changed terms. Just going to slowly skip through these. I don't want to miss the next relevant slide. Okay. So looking at the standard itself, clause by clause, We're not necessarily going to look at every single clause. We'll skip those that are not significantly changed at all. So you may see not every clause represented on these slides, but we will go through the more significant changes. As a reminder, the introduction of the standard contains notes throughout, references the notes that are found throughout the standard, and clarifies in the introduction section that those notes provide additional guidance for the requirements of the standards or how it should be applied, but those notes are not specifically auditable. What that means is they are suggestions, they're meant to guide and clarify, but it shouldn't be something that, for example, a nonconformity could be written against during an audit. Those are not hard and fast requirements of the standards, just meant to clarify. Clause 1, general requirements, includes scope and application, and an important change or note to clause 1.1 is that the organization needs to consider actions by outside providers within its scope. So what that means is it should also include those activities performed by outside providers within their footprint. An example of outside providers would be contractors. You can refer to the outside provider's definition for more examples of what would constitute an outside provider, but make sure that those actions, those activities are included within the scope and within the footprint, because even though the work is being outsourced, it's still under the control of the organization and the management system. They have control over which outside providers they use. They have control over, to a reasonable extent, how the work is done, how the waste is managed, the safety controls that are in place, the communication, the training, all of that needs to be, that accountability is on the organization who outsources that work to A, B, C, or D company. So it needs to be within the scope and within the footprint. RIOS outcomes is an entirely new section, and that outlines criteria for implementation, covers intended outcomes, and calls for proactivity. So I mentioned one of the key changes of the standard is focusing on the intended outcomes or the outcomes of the management system. Proactivity is another significant change. The standard has a tone of proactivity, as do some of the other standards, if you're familiar with, that have been revised recently, such as ISO 14001 2015 and ISO 45001 2018. There is also a greater level of proactivity required within the verbiage of the standard. In terms of the infrastructure clauses, there are requirements for assigning responsibilities and, in particular, having a management representative, but there is an emphasis on senior management to be committed, involved, and accountable. And it's the responsibility of senior management to ensure adequate resources are allotted and available for the Quality Environmental Health and Safety Management System, the QEHSMS, to meet its intended outcomes. So intended outcomes is an important concept. Definitely take a look at that term, that definition, and make sure you understand what that represents and how it relates to your organization and your system, because a lot of the measurements of effectiveness throughout the standard come back to whether or not the intended outcomes of the system are being met. And I mentioned that as one of the other significant changes as well. So we're less focused on improving the system or the documentation, but we're focusing on the output of the ability of the system to meet those intended outcomes. And you can't really have a good concept of whether or not the intended outcomes are being met if you don't understand what those intended outcomes are. 1.3 covers document and record keeping controls, and these changes are similar to those found in ISO 14001 2015 for anyone who is familiar with those revisions, whereas essentially the documentation covers both documents and records and provides a greater level of flexibility for organizations to determine what media makes sense for them or in what form that information can be found. Clause 2 covers the policy. There are some additional requirements here related to the evaluation of impacts and risks, annual reviews, senior management commitment, and a few other things. So take a look at this section to see what those changes are and if they result in the need to revise your policy. Clause 3 focuses on planning. 3.1 specifically the identification of the RIOS footprint. We have already mentioned that there is a tone of proactivity throughout the standard. So identifying the footprint and the whole risk assessment process is one of the primary methods for meeting that requirement to be proactive in the planning process, being proactive in identifying the risks before they turn into injuries or incidents or releases. The assessment is also to include purchasing, source material acquisition, transport, delivery, all those areas where, again, you might be outsourcing, as we talked about earlier, or working with outside providers. It's still within the control of the organization, it's still within the scope, and it needs to be included within the footprint. This is also to include positives, not just negatives, not just negative impacts, but there can also be positive impacts or positive contributions to the footprint as well. The footprint needs to be kept up to date, reviewed for changes, and assessed prior to making changes that could impact the QEHSMS. And this also relates to change management, having a process to evaluate changes before they are enacted to proactively avoid any negative impacts. 3.1.1 focuses on important quality risks. This is an entirely new section that requires the identification and control of risks affecting product or service quality. So again, this all comes back to the level of proactivity it calls for. An important definition as related to this section is that risk is the effect of uncertainty and can be positive or negative. Some examples are things that you might not be thinking of: employee theft, ineffective training, departure of key personnel, equipment or tool breakdown. Just a couple ideas to kind of get you started or get you thinking along the right lines, because those could have an impact on quality. There are very similar sections to the quality that we just discussed related to environmental impacts and health and safety risks. So it's the same idea. There are additional requirements, including the documentation of what that process looks like. In the case of environmental impacts, it's a rating criteria system. And in the case of health and safety risks, the expectation is that the controls will be documented. Similarly, 3.1.4 focuses on legal requirements, which include any requirements related to the product itself. And again, the controls need to be documented. You should be getting this proactivity theme here. I'm going to sound like a broken record by the time this webinar is done, but there is a very clear call for proactivity here. 3.1.5 is similar. All of these sections are similar. They just focus on different aspects of the business or processes within it, but the idea is the same. There are requirements for what needs to be documented to ensure that they have all been proactively assessed and reviewed. So 3.1.5 focuses on product, service, and customer requirements compared to the previous section, which was focused on legal requirements. So not only are you documenting the requirements themselves, you're also documenting how they will be monitored. And then the expectation is, of course, that there are records to prove those activities were done and that you're in conformance with those requirements. So how are you monitoring whether you're meeting those requirements? How are you verifying that? And the records should be there. The methods of monitoring should include products, customer requirements, outsourced activities, and source material specifications, just as a couple examples, but you'll want to review 3.1.5 to make sure you've covered everything there. 3.1.6 is kind of the other category here, identification of stakeholders and their requirements. So you have to identify who the stakeholders are in order to be able to determine what requirements they may have. And then obviously it's expected that the controls to meet those requirements will be implemented. There's a requirement in here to review this annually, and an important definition to review to make sure you've got everything accounted for would be the stakeholder definition. So some additional examples include company owners, a landlord if you have one, any requirements that the insurance companies might have in terms of reporting or anything like that. Those are just a couple examples. Section 3.2 covers improvement planning. There are additional inputs or considerations for establishing your goals as an organization within the QEHS-MS. The standard now requires written plans for how those goals will be achieved, including identifying the specific tasks, any resource needs, how those responsibilities are assigned, any relevant due dates, and methods for evaluating the results. So this is more prescriptive in that you need to identify these things and you need to document them so that they're available, they can be checked against, they can be reviewed during an audit, things like that. Change management has its own section. This is entirely new to the standard, and it requires a written plan, a written change management process. And change management, the expectation is that the footprint will be reviewed for relevant changes prior to implementing a change that can impact the QEHS-MS and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So we did touch on this before, and this is how it relates. 3.3 covers change management. The idea, again, proactive in your approach. So before you're making a change that's going to impact the system, you are reviewing the potential impact of that change, assessing whether it's something that you can manage, implementing controls before making that change instead of retroactively responding to the change after it's been made, trying to get those controls in place before someone gets hurt or a spill occurs, something like that, or worse yet, responding to an incident that occurred before you got your arms around the necessary controls for a change that was already made. That is, by definition, the opposite of proactive. So the change management process formalizes that requirement into a written process. Clause 4 covers implementation. In 4.1.1, we cover competency. There are some changes here. The need to identify what those competency requirements are, maintain records as evidence of competence, and to verify the effectiveness of that process. There are criteria added to this section to be considered for training needs or the training process. And all of this, the competency requirements, are as relevant to the QEHS-MS ability to achieve the intended outcomes. So What that means is that it might not be the same across the board. Some departments, some job titles might have a different potential impact or less or greater potential to impact the ability of the system to meet its intended outcomes. So there may be some departments that have the potential for a huge impact on the intended outcomes, and others might have next to none. And the competency requirements and process can reflect that. So this is all as relevant to their ability to affect the intended outcomes. It may not be the same across the board. It certainly can be handled that way, taking the more conservative approach, but some jobs will have a higher potential to impact this, and the competency should at least be at that level for everyone, if not varying as relevant to their just lost my train of thought, but their ability to affect the intended outcomes. I didn't detail them on this slide. There are a couple additional considerations or requirements of topics under the awareness clause 4.1.2. The main change for 4.2 regarding communication is a requirement to document the communication plans. There are subsequent subclauses that cover the different types of communication: customer communication, supplier communication, outside supplier communication, which used to be referred to as contractor communication, and external communication. So for customer communication, if there are any customer qualifications or customer requirements related to the QEHS system or outputs, then that would need to be included here. Supplier communication refers to communication of source control requirements, load rejections, errors, things like that. As I said, outside supplier communication refers to contractor communication and has some clarified language here. Nothing significant enough to break down on the slides, but it is a little bit different than it was before. And external communication requires communication of relevant quality, environmental, health, and safety information with visitors, stakeholders, pretty much everyone who doesn't have their own subclause here. Examples might include what the emergency plans are, reporting on-site chemicals such as to the fire department, tier 2 chemical reporting. Certainly the emergency plans would be relevant for visitors or anyone else who might be on site but not necessarily familiar with the company's process should an emergency arise, things like that. .3 covers operational controls. There is a subclause for source materials. This was restructured and it was previously located within the suppliers section of RIOS 2006. There are some clarified requirements in this section, as well as expanded control expectations. So if this is something that is relevant to your organization, certainly take a closer look at the changes there. Again, outsourced providers, products and services has been restructured and refers to what was previously the contractor section. There are additional requirements similar to purchasing controls, so documented specs, controls as relevant to their potential for an impact on the quality, environmental, or health and safety, performance or outputs. There are requirements for records of evaluation and monitoring, things like that. Again, take a closer look at that section if that is something that is relevant to your organization. 4.4 covers quality controls, which is a new section. It requires the documentation of specifications and requirements, worker instructions, all that kind of stuff. Similarly, there are two subsequent clauses, environmental controls and health and safety controls. So they take a similar format, separating the three. Environmental controls includes requiring documented controls to minimize any environmental impacts, and the health and safety control section requires documented controls to minimize health and safety hazards, including those other hazards within the scope, such as outsourcing, source materials, contractors, offsite activities, chemicals, equipment, etc. 4.7 covers emergency preparedness. There are no significant changes to this section. I just wanted to highlight the relationship between the emergency preparedness clause and the requirements for having emergency plans that include X, Y, and Z with the need to communicate the emergency expectations as discussed in clause 4.2 with anyone to whom that information would be relevant, such as visitors to the facility. Clause 5 focuses on checking and corrective action. 5.1 covers monitoring and measurement. There are some additional items to be covered in the plan for monitoring and measurement. The relevant subclause, activities requiring monitoring or measurement. Again, there are some additional items here to be monitored. So take a look at these sections and fill in any gaps that this might have created in your current documentation structure. QEHS compliance is in section 5.1.2, and this requires an annual evaluation of legal and stakeholder requirements. There is also added verbiage about personnel competency for whoever is responsible for that evaluation of compliance. They have to meet certain competency requirements that have been added or clarified within the standard. .1.3 covers maintenance and calibration. There are some additional requirements here, including the documentation of requirements and any actions taken to address out of tolerance monitoring devices. So kind of maintaining that paper trail, closing the loop on when things are found out of calibration or out of tolerance, what was done about that, what, if any, impact did that have, and being able to, again, close the loop on that as to whether they were subsequently calibrated and now are okay to use, things like that. 5.1.4 requires the outputs of monitoring and measuring be considered as inputs to the management review. That's the only significant change there. 5.2 covers nonconformance and both corrective and preventive actions. 5.2.2 specifically covers incident investigations. This is a new section requiring investigation of all EHS incidents. And this is important in that you should reference the definition of an incident, which, if you take a look at the definition, includes near misses. Near misses are not always investigated, and this is important to note. Again, this circles back to or resonates with that call for a greater level of proactivity. There is also a change for previous nonconformities to be reviewed for effectiveness, not just for the previous cycle, as had been the process for years, but actually going back 2 audit cycles. So not just the previous audit, but the one before that will be relevant. Those nonconformities will be reviewed for continued effectiveness. We do see some repeat findings or some things that were not really, there was no systemic change, or maybe they didn't identify the correct root cause, and the same issue would crop up over the next 2 or 3 years. So this is, again, circling back to the proactivity, but also the effectiveness of the investigation process and the root cause analysis process and how effective those corrective actions truly are. If you're not identifying the correct root cause or putting in an effective corrective action that relates to the root cause, you will eventually see the same issue again, most likely. It's important to note that for RIOS 2016 audits, both during recertification audits and during transition audits, all NCRs, even minors, will need to include evidence of effective implementation prior to acceptance and closure per the transition requirements of the RIOS 2016 standard. So, in other words, the requirements that came out in conjunction with the standard being revised require evidence of implementation for even minors during a recert or the transition audit. We would typically in the past only require evidence of effective implementation for major nonconformities, but you will now find that even during a recertification audit or a transition audit, we need objective evidence for minors as well before that new certificate gets issued to make sure you've really gotten your arms around that finding in an effective manner. So to remind anyone who is unsure the impact that that has, we'll be looking for both the correction and the corrective action to be written in past tense because you've already completed those activities, and then you'll need to provide evidence of completing the correction and the corrective action. So typically for a minor, otherwise you have a year to implement the change and show us the evidence at the following audit, and the responses are written in future tense as to what you plan to do. So for transition and recertification audits, even minors will require effective implementation evidence before your auditor can accept the responses and we can, close out the package or send it for review. So that's an important change for our clients to be aware of. 5.3 covers internal audits. Annual audits are required, a full system annual internal audit prior to the certification or recertification. So whenever your recertification audit is due, make sure you have scheduled your internal audit before that date. That is something that we need to see take place before the recertification audit so that can be part of our audit sampling. And finally, Clause 6 covers management review. This section provides some additional clarity relating to inputs and outputs that are required by the standard. Nothing super significant or worth detailing line by line, but certainly take a look at this section and see if it impacts for example, your management review meeting agenda of the inputs and outputs that you're to cover, and make any revisions needed accordingly. Okay, so for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time and not familiar with the process, or I guess even lapsed if you didn't transition on time for RIOS 2006 and now you will be pursuing certification for RIOS 2016 all over again, the first step in the certification process would be to get a copy of the standard. And for RIOS, you can purchase a copy of the standard by contacting Michelle Woody, and I've included her email address on the screen. You need to know what the requirements of the standard are before you can implement a system that meets those requirements. So if you don't already have a copy, purchase a copy. And the next step would be to establish the documentation for your QEHSMS, which is the Quality Environmental Health and Safety Management System, anything that's required by the standard. Subsequent to establishing the documentation, you would conduct any necessary training to meet those requirements. implement any controls relevant to those requirements, including conducting your internal audit, your compliance evaluation, and subsequently your management review, which you would do after your internal audit so that the outputs of the internal audit can be an input to the management review. You'll also need to contract with a certification body such as PJR to schedule and conduct your audits and assess your conformity to the requirements of the standard. And then to obtain certification when pursuing registration or certification for the first time, you will have a stage 1 audit and then a stage 2 audit. So we'll talk more about those audits on the next slide. But any nonconformities that result from the stage 2 audit, you would address and submit to the auditor. We do our internal review processes, and then you would be issued a certificate. So those audits that we referenced, the stage 1 constitutes a documentation review to make sure the framework is in place to meet the requirements of the standard, and evaluate your readiness to move on to stage 2. Stage 2 is a full system audit of the entire QEHSMS, including all shifts that you have, all processes. You may be issued nonconformities as a result of this audit, which would need to be resolved before a certificate could be issued. Once the certificate is issued, it's good for 3 years, and you will be placed on a surveillance cycle, which includes either semi-annual or annual audits based on the contract and the client's preference. And those represent partial system audits. They're not all the processes, all the shifts. It would be a sampling. On that 3rd year, you would have a recertification audit, which is identical really to the stage 2 audit in that it covers all the processes, all the shifts, and results in a new certificate being issued after any nonconformities are addressed and the package is closed out. And that's what the 3-year cycle looks like. It would start again from there. So we've got a good amount of time for questions. If you haven't already typed your questions in, feel free to do so now, and I'm going to put my contact information on the screen in the meantime. So again, I'm Austin. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR, and my email address is here, and I can be reached through the PJR main line. They can put you through to my extension. We also have an EHS Program Manager. Her name is Stacy DeSantis. Her email, and she can be contacted through the main number. Her email is on the slide as well. And if you are a new prospective client or customer and you're looking for a quote to pursue RIOS 2016 certification or any other standard to which we're accredited, feel free to contact our sales department. I have that number on the screen as well. So let's see if there are any questions I can answer. Okay, I don't see any questions. I can hang out for another minute to see if anyone is currently typing. And I can also be contacted via email or phone if there's something that you'd like to discuss offline. Again, my contact information is on the screen. The slides from today's presentation and a recording of today's webinar will be on PJR's website after the presentation. Since there aren't any questions, I will sign off. Thank you all for joining us. If you have already transitioned, I hope that process went well and this webinar was informative to reinforce some of those main changes. And if you are getting ready to pursue certification, I hope the webinar is helpful in highlighting those areas in which you need to focus to prepare for your audit. Thank you so much for attending today, and have a great day.